guys. I want to talk to you guys about some of the end range cadence work that you're doing starting now and you're going to continue to do throughout the season. By end range, this is what I mean. Most athletes have a kind of natural cadence range that they'll fall into and where they're most comfortable racing and training, and a range that really allows them to hit their potential. Everybody's body is a little bit different. Sometimes with athletes with really bigger muscle groups will be more comfortable hitting higher power numbers at low cadence, sometimes even as low as 70, 75. Athletes who don't quite have as much muscular strength will tend to fall into the higher cadence range. But as a rule of thumb for triathletes, we generally tend to see comfortable cadence ranges falling in about that 75 to 95 range. It's a very big range. Unlike the thinking that we've had, earlier on in this decade, where we were really kind of emphasizing high cadence so that athletes are able to run off the bike. We now have studies showing that that's really not the case. The key is to find a cadence that allows you to go the fastest and be the most efficient so that you're able to come off the bike and run well. End range refers to cadence ranges that are outside of that normal comfortable zone. So low RPM stuff, below 75, even sometimes as low as 50, 60, and then high RPM, which is 95 and above, and sometimes up to 110. So both of those ranges of cadence have some specific purposes. And we start those in the early season because this is a time of year where we can really work on the technical aspect of those pedal strokes and really get used to getting out of our comfort zone with our cadence. But at this point, we're not loading on a ton of power. You're going to see a lot of zones 2, 3, some short efforts in 4, 5, but our goal during this part of the season is not to create a lot of fatigue on your body. It's to start to teach your body to do things well and consistently. So I'm going to talk about the purpose of why we do those things this time of year in each of those ranges. For low RPMs, we're doing a couple things. We're working on pedal stroke. When you're going slower, you can't rely on momentum to get your legs around. And you'll find when you start going slower, you really have to use all of your muscles to create a complete pedal stroke. What you want to think about when you're doing those is smooth tension all the way around the pedal stroke. A lot of people, when they get into those bigger gears, and they'll do the same thing when they're outside climbing on a hill, want to mash down. So their pedal stroke is emphasizing that mashing down part, which really utilizes a lot of the quads and can fatigue you pretty quickly. One way you can kind of notice whether you're doing that or not is if you're trying to do those low RPM intervals and you start to see your head bobbing up and down. That's a pretty good indication that you're overemphasizing that downstroke. So what you want to think about is engage your abs, engage your glutes, and then have them be kind of the prime movers for the pedal stroke. And once they're nice and strong, then let all those other helper muscles, your hamstrings, your quads, your calves, all help to get your leg around the pedal stroke smoothly. But think smooth, even pedal strokes. And when you're doing low RPMs, you can often find a kind of a dead spot in your pedal stroke, a place where, it's often that top part where you're coming up around and it's just kind of hard to do that. So you can start to hone in some areas where you need to work on your personal techniques by doing these lower RPMs. Another purpose of the low RPM intervals is strength. It's kind of equivalent to strength training on the bike. So by going lower RPM in a bigger gear, we are recruiting more muscle fibers and we're making those muscles stronger. The more muscle fibers we have available to us to help do the work, the less fatigue we're going to create on a race day. So creating strength and recruiting more muscle fibers is another purpose of why we do this early on in the season. Then we go to those high RPM intervals, and that's where you see anything above 95 to 100. And there's two purposes to that this time of year. One is neuromuscular activation, or in other words, getting your brain to talk to your muscles quickly. So when we all of a sudden ask ourselves to go really fast, really quick, all of a sudden our brain has to say, okay, nerves, fire, do it. And so by doing them in really short increments this time of year, we're creating that mind-body connection. And we are also stressing the cardiovascular system a little bit more than the muscles. So it is a way to keep in touch with that higher end cardio system. But again, we don't do these with exceptionally high power this time of year, or if we do them for very short intervals, 30 seconds, maybe minute max. But its purpose is not to create fatigue for you in that particular workout. So our hope is that by starting these cadence intervals earlier in the season, then as the season progresses and you have the technique down pat, we can start adding power to those lower RPM or higher RPM intervals. And then they do serve other purposes, which we'll talk about as the season progresses. But we also hope that by doing these big variations in what's comfortable for you with cadence, that come race season, you're going to have a bigger toolbox of cadences that you can choose from during a race, because there's benefits to sometimes using a higher cadence and sometimes using a lower cadence. We'll talk more about that as the season progresses. But if you don't ever practice it in training, you're not going to feel comfortable doing it in a race. And I wouldn't recommend going out and doing something in a race that you've never done in training. You guys have never heard me say that before, I'm sure. But I just wanted to go over why we're doing these and kind of what we're trying to achieve. And, the real key thing is, as you're doing these, if you're doing the high RPM intervals, do them without bouncing in the saddle. If you're bouncing in the saddle all over the place and rocking all over, you need to add a little bit of gear. And those low RPMs, make sure you're not really mashing down with your quads and kind of tense with your upper body and bobbing your head up and down. Really think about full, complete pedal strokes. You're going to be out of your comfort zone. Some of you guys in particular, I used to be a 95 cadence person, and that was all I ever wanted to do. And when someone asked me to go lower, I resisted it from a mental point of view, and then my body just didn't want to do it. And having spent a lot of time last year dialing more into that, I really do have a bigger range of skills that I can use during a race. So again, we'll talk about those skills and when you would use them in a race as the season progresses. But for now, this is just a little bit of an overview of the high and the low cadence work that we're doing this time of the season.